My colleague and Spectrum News Washington correspondent Evan Koslof is in our Washington, D.C. studio. Evan, good to see you. Trump doing pretty well in some of these races so far.
Right. I think there's basically two ways to look at this. Of course, you could look at just sort of the top line delegate number. And in that sense, both candidates did very well. They're both sort of on a glide path to get the nomination. And that means we're going to have a redo of 2020. So that's the big picture when you look at the delegate count. But that being said, I think that if you look a little deeper, there are vulnerabilities that they both have, as they both are somewhat weak candidates in some ways. You know, for example, the obvious way is that former President Donald Trump still has Nikki Haley hanging around. And as long as the money keeps flowing, she'll be able to be there, taking votes away from him, at least here in the primary. I mean, you can look at some of the numbers. For example, North Carolina, she brought in some 22.4%. Virginia, another leaning blue state, but has been a swing state in the past, there, some 34.7%. And then in Vermont, she actually won the state with some 49.7%. So that's problem number one for former President Donald Trump. But interestingly, if you look into the numbers a little bit as well for the current president, Joe Biden, he too is grappling with some weaknesses. I mean, if you look at some of these swing states, for example, he's not running against any large established candidate, but some 11.5% in Virginia, for example, went for Marianne Williamson. In North Carolina, as you've been talking about, over 12% for no preference. Colorado, 7.2% for non-committal delegate. And in Oklahoma, 18% for Marianne Williamson or for Dean Phillips. So I think that both of these candidates have a lot to celebrate. Of course, they're going to win the nomination. But on top of that, they also need to deal with some of these vulnerabilities. The question is, are these just protest votes? You know, none of this it matters as far as who's going to be elected. When it comes down to the general election, will these voters actually show up? That's going to be the big question, Ruben.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Nikki Haley, yes, she did pick up a win in Vermont. That's her second primary win of this primary season. She picked up the District of Columbia a couple days ago. But, Evan, these are small states. I mean, you're not getting many delegates. What's the path forward for her? Is there one?
Right. She's been saying along the way that she wants this to be an election, not a coronation, and she wanted the people to speak. But now we've actually had millions of people speak, and so far she's not gotten a lot of the delegates. It's possible she's positioning herself as sort of a backup plan in case some of these legal problems substantiate for Donald Trump. That's one approach. Also, it just comes down to the money in a lot of ways. As long as the money pours in, she could stay in the race. She brought in $28 million in January and February. The question is, will that money dry up? Now that she has lost big time on Super Tuesday, she lost her home state of South Carolina. So I think it might come down to money, Ruben.
You got to have the money to stay in. Evan Koslof, good to see you, sir, and we'll see you soon.
We now want to go to our national reporter, Evan Koslof. He has been following the races today.
Well, hi there, Nicole. Great context there. Texas is going to be a really interesting state to watch. And as we look at the overall headline, if you were waiting for a lot of suspense and drama, you're probably not getting it tonight because the front runners are running away with this one. We're seeing the President Joe Biden, former President Donald Trump, clearing many of these states here, all of them, in fact. Let's talk about what's at stake here. You mentioned the 15 states and the territory. You're now looking on your screen there at them, including the big states with a lot of delegates, including Texas and California. The results are starting to pour in, and so we are starting to get a good picture about what the headlines are going to be about tonight. Now, the winners of these primaries were exactly what we expected. It was the front runners, President Joe Biden, former President Donald Trump. So it's not really that they're winning. What we really want to look at is at the numbers to try and get a sense of what turnout is like, what the appetite for these two candidates is like from voters. Let's talk about what's at stake. We've been showing you this map all evening here. There are some 15 states that were voting today on Super Tuesday, as well as the American Samoa, including some big states like Texas and California. More than 35% of the delegates are actually up for grabs tonight. So let's run through some of the results. First, starting with Virginia. It's now been hours since polls closed there. This is a state that leans blue, especially national elections. Biden won by some 10%, and yet it does have a Republican governor. So it's an interesting state to look at. You can see there, he's got some 88.5% of the vote. I want to point out the people that are getting votes that are not Joe Biden in these races. You can see right there almost 25,000 votes for Marianne Williamson. 8% of the vote. Meanwhile, let's take a look at Republicans, where right now former President Donald Trump is leading the pack, 63.3% of the votes. Nikki Haley, just 34.7%. Next, let's move to North Carolina. This is way more of a swing state. In 2020, Trump won by just under 75,000 votes. And right now, as you can see, President Biden has 87.9%. And yet, nearly 70,000 people there voted for no preference. We got to lock that away and think about that. Let's move on now to Republicans now, where former President Donald Trump is doing quite well there, 74.8% compared to Nikki Haley's 22.5%. Moving on, let's talk about Maine. This is a blue state typically. Biden won by 9% in 2020, and yet Senator Collins endorsed Haley, hoping that this would make a difference there. Let's start with the Democratic Party, where Biden's doing quite well, 93% of the vote. Phillips got 2,600. And now let's jump over to the Republican side. With that Collins endorsement, Haley still lagging behind. She had 26.5%. Former President Donald Trump had 71.8%. Let's talk about Colorado also. This is, of course, the state where there was an attempt to remove Trump from the ballot, and then the Supreme Court had to step in to stop that. Starting on the Democratic side, you see Joe Biden there has 84.8%, and yet 33,000 votes there for non-committed delegate. Lock that away. Now let's talk about the Republican side and take a look at those numbers in Colorado. There we got former President Donald Trump with 62.9%. Nikki Haley has 242,000 votes, 33.8% of the vote there. I should note that it's not been a clean sweep for Biden. He did lose American Samoa. The vote count was just 51-40, so not a lot of votes there. The winner was Jason Palmer. Next, let's talk about the delegate count, if we can, where we have President Biden at this point accruing some 430 delegates. Others got 4, and uncommitted got 2. Meanwhile, let's take a look on the Republican side, where former President Donald Trump right now has 353. Nikki Haley has 43. So all the candidates here still have some work to go. They're not going to be clinching tonight on Super Tuesday. The soonest that they can actually clinch is going to be on March 12th for Republicans, March 19th for the Democrats. And again, what we really want to look at is turnout and how many of these votes are not going to those frontrunners.
Yeah, Evan, and it's not just the presidential primaries. As we've been talking about a lot of these Texas contested primaries, what other primaries are you watching across the country?
Right. Well, of course, Texas is going to be an extremely interesting race, but I'll let you guys talk about that and give all the context there. Let's dive into North Carolina, though. There's an interesting race there to try and replace the governor there, who's been term limited. That's Roy Cooper. And right now, as you can see on the Democratic side, Josh Stein is leading the way. That's the attorney general over there, and has 69.4% of the vote. Let's compare now on the Republican side, where the lieutenant governor, Max Robinson, is the top candidate there, has 69.5% of the vote in North Carolina. And another interesting race to talk about is over in Alabama. That's where we've got this House race in District 1 where there was redistricting, and as a result, 2 Republicans are going up against each other, 2 incumbents. One of them will no longer be in Congress. We've got Representative Jerry Carl and Barry Moore, and right now, as you can see, it's a close one. Barry Moore has 56% of the vote. The last thing I'll talk about is this California race. As they're working to replace the late Dianne Feinstein, who passed away in the fall, a trio of Democrats from Congress are running for that position, as is a Republican who's a former baseball player. So it should be interesting to see who rises to the top. The top 2 are going to go off to have another race there later on, but it could be 2 Democrats. It could also be a Democrat and a Republican. We're going to have to wait and see. They've got about an hour to go before polls close there in California.
Get over to our national reporter, Evan Koslof, now. He's got a look at what's happening around the rest of the country where primaries and caucuses are taking place. Evan?
Well, I think there are really 2 ways to look at the results tonight. Of course, if you just look by the delegate count, it was a very good night for the 2 frontrunners. That's President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. But there is another way to look at this, because there are some vulnerabilities and some weaknesses if you look at both of their results tonight. Of course, for Donald Trump, the big problem right now is Nikki Haley, who's just continued to be a thorn in his side. If you look at some of the numbers, Haley, for example, got 23% in North Carolina, 34, almost 35% in Virginia, and she actually won in Vermont. These are not going to get her enough delegates to disrupt his nomination, but it is a question of whether these voters will come home. Will they come back to former President Donald Trump when it comes to the general election? And there's really the same exact question on the other side of the ticket, where President Joe Biden won easily on the delegate march as he marches towards the nomination. However, if you look at some of these numbers, for example, Virginia, a swing state that leans blue, over 11% voted for Marianne Williamson or Dean Phillips. In North Carolina, another swing state, 12.5% voted for no preference over President Biden. Colorado, over 7%. And even in Oklahoma, some 18%. That's a pretty red state, but 18% for Marianne Williamson or Dean Phillips. So really, both sides here pretty unpopular, and so it's expected that you would see some of these protest votes. But the question is, these are protest votes. When we get to the general election, will they come back? Will they stay on the couch? These are open questions.